Hello, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to the Instituto Juan de Mariana. It's a really pleasure to have here one of the, in my opinion, most bright and original thinkers in the libertarian tradition. It's not, unfortunately, it's not a much well-known philosopher here in Spain, but precisely we are trying to organize this conference, and in a future, hopefully, we'll try to translate one of his important books, Libertad Archipelago, into Spanish, because his contributions to giving and providing a more solid basis to the libertarian philosophy and to the libertarian tradition are, in my opinion, very, very outstanding. So here we have Chandran Kukathas. He's head of the political science department in the London School of Economics, and as I said, one of the most original thinkers, in my opinion, in the libertarian tradition. He will talk about a topic which has been, I would say, unfortunately, quite controversial in the last months here in Spain, which is the controversy around secession. In Spain, as you are all aware of, there's a quite strong relationship between libertarianism and, let's say, unionism or Spanish nationalism or Spanish constitutionalism, in order not to offend anyone. And it seems to be incompatible to defend freedom and to be in favor of secession. Professor Kukathas has stressed in his very important book that in the lastly, the basis of freedom is freedom of association and de-association, and therefore the freedom of secession. So many people may think that he's a nationalist in Spain, but he's precisely an anti-nationalist because he sees communitarianism as a threat to freedom. So his perspectives will be very valuable not only for the libertarian audience here in Spain, but also for the more broad debate on whether we should allow people to secede from the Spanish government or not. Thank you very much for being here, and we can start.
Thank you. Well, firstly, thank you very much, Juan Ramon and the Institute for inviting me here, and thank you all for coming. Now, when I agreed to give this talk, I was asked what I would like to talk about, and I was given a number of different options, and I said I was happy to speak about any of these things. And I see from the title that I'm talking about everything that I know, and also about some things I don't know so much about, which is about the Spanish situation with respect to Catalonia. So I'm not going to say anything about that directly, but I'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers. And I hope you'll learn something from me, but I may well learn much more from you in this regard. So what I really want to talk about then is more broadly about the idea of freedom and the idea of what is a free society, and that will inevitably touch on questions of nationality and questions of individuality and secession. So let me begin with some questions of definition. Maybe beginning with the question of the definition of freedom, although usually in inquiries of this sort we should end with the definitions. But I want to start with the definition in order to identify certain problems we have in trying to talk about freedom. There are very, very few people who are against freedom. Certainly, in the history of the modern world, freedom has been a very, very important ideal, and it's one that's been transmitted elsewhere to places that haven't had this as a dominant idea. Just like democracy, it's been exported. So it's hard to find someone who's against freedom, but everybody thinks about freedom in slightly different ways. And so it's important to recognize, at least at the outset, what are some of the alternative ways of thinking about freedom. Now, one very, very simple way to think about freedom is to say that freedom is something that you enjoy if there are no obstacles or impediments or restrictions on your action. But a very simple view of this would suggest that any impediment to your action is a restriction on your freedom. Even, for example, if someone comes up to you and puts a gun to your head and says, "Give me your money or I'll kill you," you could say, well, on the one hand, he's restricting your freedom in one respect. On the other hand, he's also giving you a choice. So you've got a free choice, right? He's not just shooting you and taking your money. He's giving you a choice. Okay. So on one view, the view that Thomas Hobbes advanced in the 17th century was that you were still free. You were only free if you were really literally prevented. Now, there's some obvious problems with this view because it can't take into account some things that we all take for granted, which is that certain kinds of restrictions do count as restrictions on freedom, and other kinds of restrictions don't count as restrictions on freedom. Why is it that saying to someone, "You can't steal," is not a restriction on his freedom? It's as much a restriction on what he can do as is the restriction placed on someone by the act of stealing from him. So there's a problem with this very, very simple account of freedom. But then the problem that arises is, how do you think about freedom without inserting into the definition some other values? Because once you start saying, no, it's not just a matter of literal prevention, it's a matter of which preventions are legitimate, now the definition of freedom turns to the problem of what is legitimate intervention, what is a legitimate restriction. And this is something I think that theorists of freedom have always struggled with. They've sought a kind of neutral definition of freedom, but they've never really been able to secure one. Even when they've insisted that the definition of liberty or freedom is simply what's called in the literature on freedom the negative idea of freedom. You're free as long as you're not prevented or restricted or impeded in some way. They've ended up offering a kind of theory of freedom which distinguishes between legitimate and illegitimate understandings of freedom. So what this means, I think, is that almost any definition, if it's going to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate ways of limiting people, is going to give us a definition of freedom that is in some sense shaped by some kind of other commitment, some kind of ethical beliefs about what kinds of things are permitted. Okay? But this now also creates a certain kind of difficulty, and that is that if you want to understand what a free society is, and you recognize that people are different and they have different ethical views, they have different convictions, these may come out of personal experience, they might come out of different religious traditions that they come from, it might come out of different political experience. It's going to be very difficult to arrive at a definition of freedom which simply says, here is an impartial definition of freedom, which doesn't simply favor my own particular ethical convictions. And I think for me, this is then the challenge that's taken up by one particular family of theories of freedom, which I think of as the liberal tradition of freedom. It's not that people haven't thought about freedom before or since, but to me, what liberalism is, libertarianism I think of as a kind of liberalism. What liberalism thinks is that we have to take seriously the differences among people in terms of their ethical beliefs and find some way of associating that doesn't simply try to impose upon people with different beliefs one set of convictions about how one should live. Now, the problem here is, how can you do it? Because even this is a kind of ethical conviction. Liberalism itself has some ethical conviction. It says you shouldn't use force. Well, that is itself a kind of ethical view. So in a way, you can't escape the need to find some ethical content for any understanding of freedom. So what I've sought to do in my thinking about this is to say, okay, we can't escape the idea of starting with some minimal ethical conviction, but that ethical conviction should be the commitment to trying as much as possible to respect the fact that people have different ethical convictions. This is the fundamental ethical conviction we should start from. We respect the fact that people have different views, different ideas. They even have ideas which are unwilling to accept this starting ethical premise. They may be unwilling to accept the idea that you should respect difference. They may not be willing to do this because they may come to the debate or to the discussion or to the conflict with convictions that come from their religion, that come from their cultural background, that come from their political experience. But what the liberal, I think, says is that regardless of whether they accept this or not, this is what we stand for. We stand for the idea that we will respect different views, even if they don't conform to our own fundamental conviction about respecting ethical difference. This, I think, is the liberal idea of freedom. Now, the question is, how can this idea not only be theorized, how can we give expression to this, but also how can this be implemented? Because what would it mean to have a society in which different ethical views were respected and allowed to coexist? How would this be possible? And here I think I want to suggest that there are two kinds of liberal answers to this. One liberal view says, well, what we need to establish is a kind of liberal society in which ultimately everybody shares these liberal convictions. Everybody believes that what we need is a society in which everybody is, at least to some extent, a liberal. They believe in freedom, at least to some degree, and they believe some things that go with this conviction about freedom. One of those things is most fundamentally equality, because liberals have a commitment to freedom, but it's the freedom for everybody. It's not just the freedom for some. So that means equality is fundamental. So what is your attitude then to those who don't respect freedom, who don't care for it as an ideal, and who don't respect or care for the ideal of equality? And I think the liberal response is, well, because we believe in freedom and because we believe in equality and we respect and recognize differences, we have to accommodate these differences. A liberal society, therefore, is somehow a society that's going to accept these people. But there is, as I said, a liberal view that says, no, this is not feasible because this is going to undermine the whole liberal project. So we have to have a society in which everyone at least commits to these fundamental ideas, even if it's just at a very minimal level. Everybody has to believe in liberty. Everybody has to believe in equality. I want to put forward the idea that a liberal society is in fact not one that takes this attitude. It's one that takes the attitude that, well, we will tolerate people with different views, even if they don't feel this commitment to liberalism, even if they don't feel this commitment to the ideals of liberty and equality. Now, there are two questions here. One is whether this is feasible. Can this even be made to work? And the other question is, well, why would you do this? Why would you want to hold to this interpretation of liberalism? So let me take the second of these questions first. Why would you want to hold to this idea that a liberal society would be one that tolerates even those who themselves aren't liberals, who may even be so hostile to liberalism that they're looking to undermine it? Okay? And what I want to say to you here is that I think this is, in a sense, a part of the liberal creed, which we can see already in the way in which liberal societies operate. They operate in a way that, because it respects and values freedom, is unwilling to suppress dissent. It's unwilling to suppress challenges to anything, including itself. This is why you'll find in liberal societies, for example, communist parties dedicated to revolution. You'll find fascist parties. You'll find all kinds of very, very anti-liberal societies and communities and movements and traditions all coexisting, because liberalism is fundamentally reluctant to suppress dissent from its ideals. Now, there are many different sorts of philosophical arguments that have been advanced by liberals who thought in this way. Not all of them have been equally convincing, but the one I'm most sympathetic to is, in a way, a certain kind of argument from, well, a kind of humility. It says, of course, there's a limit to how much we can understand. There's a limit to how much we can simply know. How are we to work out what are the right ideals? And the conviction here is that we only come to understand these things through engagement. It's not a skeptical position. It's not saying that we can't know anything, but it's saying, how do we learn? Well, we only learn by engaging with others. We only learn by cooperating, by communicating, by arguing, by debate. It's not that this is guaranteed to give us the truth, but we also have this very strong conviction that simply appealing to authority or choosing someone or some group and investing them with this power is not the path to coming to an understanding. So this is a kind of, if you like, a kind of epistemological basis for liberalism. This is why liberals might think about this way, think about liberalism this way. It's for these views about how we come to understand and how we come to figure out how it is that we should live together and how we should describe the theory of how we live together. But that's the theoretical part. What about the question of practice? Is such a society feasible? This is a very big question. And here everything really turns on what you understand by a society and what you mean by feasible. Okay? And this is something that liberals have also grappled with quite a lot. Those who worry about the idea of a liberal society as not being willing to enforce even its own principles are fearful that if we take this path, what's going to happen is that a liberal society will fall apart. It simply is not sustainable. Well, one response to this is to say, that may be the case, but in fact nothing lasts forever. I don't think we have a theory of how we perpetuate a particular kind of social order forever, or even for 1,000 years or 100 years. The history of human society is very variable, and looking over the history of the world, looking at all the different societies we've seen, I think it's very hard to see what are the principles that some of them have found that make them survive over a very long period of time. There isn't really a single theory. So if we're worried about self-perpetuation, I actually don't think we know how to do it. At least not if we're worried about doing this for a very long period of time. It's not that we don't have theories of institutions to help us think about how we might survive in the short term, and those, are important considerations. There are considerations of constitutional design and institutional design that we need to attend to. But we don't really know how to make something last forever, and probably nothing ever does. David Hume said at the end of his essay on the idea of a perfect commonwealth, he said, "Rust will grow to the springs of the most perfect political machine and disorder its motions." So we haven't got a theory for how we should preserve order forever. So one response to this challenge that, unless we find some way of making everyone a liberal, we're not going to get that sort of stability, is to say, well, what is the stability that you're looking for, and how can we achieve it? If you're looking for stability in what John Rawls calls, long-run equilibrium, kind of stability that will last well into the future, I'm not so sure that it's achievable. So that's one thing. Okay, but the other thing is, what is going to be the price of pursuing that unity and stability that you think is necessary to preserve liberal ideals? Because one of the things that might be a serious cost then is the suppression of certain liberal ideas, the suppression of certain freedoms, the dereliction of certain liberal practices that uphold freedom and equality in order to preserve the ideals of liberalism in the first place. And here I think, what I worry about more than the risk of not lasting forever or even well into the future is the danger that in an attempt to preserve liberal ideals, we at the same time undermine them by trying to force people to believe things that they don't believe, to act in ways they don't like or they find resistible. In this respect, I think this speaks very much to the situation in countries like Spain, where there are dissenters, there are differences. To what extent can you force people to live in ways that you want when they don't want to live in this way? There is a danger, of course, to stability, but then from a liberal point of view, the question is, how far are you willing to go in order to secure that stability? And there are many cases in the history of the world where an attempt to preserve that stability has also led to violence and disruption, because when you come to a certain point, if people don't share your convictions, the more you try to enforce your convictions, the more you will create resistance. So from my point of view, what liberalism counsels is a certain attitude that says we will, as much as we can, try to tolerate differences of opinion, differences of attitude, differences of outlook, even to the extent of embracing people whose attitudes and ideas are not only different from our own, but even against our own. This is the idea of a society that I tried to elaborate in my book, The Liberal Archipelago. And what I offer here then is a different model of what a liberal society looks like than I think is found in most liberal theorizing about a political society. Most political theories of a liberal society, I think, have started out in a very different way by asking what are the appropriate principles for the workings of a liberal state. And let me illustrate this a little bit by talking about a thinker I've written a lot about, F.A. Hayek, who was someone who in the early 20th century was concerned about the rise in particular of nationalism, which he saw most fearfully in the rise of Nazism in Germany, but then he thought was also on the rise in countries of the liberal democratic West. He therefore wrote a book called The Road to Serfdom, in which he attacked this particular tendency. And he thought what was most necessary was the recovery of the liberal ideal in the face of the onslaught by what he saw as various forms of nationalism. Socialism he regarded as a particular form of nationalism, but it also manifested itself in other forms, notably in Soviet totalitarianism, which also then extended to other parts of the world. So Hayek set out to elaborate a theory of the liberal state. His first attempt was in his book, The Road to Serfdom, but it culminated in his great work of 1960, The Constitution of Liberty. Here he answered the question, what does a liberal state look like? And the model he had here really was the German notion of a Rechtsstaat, a state founded on ideals of right. If you like, in another word, a constitutional state or a lawful state. A state that was therefore imbued with certain liberal convictions about the importance of individual equality, of freedom, and of the rule of law. But the problem I think that Hayek found with this conception was that what it required was the elaboration of a theory of the state, which conceived it as a kind of closed society, which ultimately was wrestling with the problem of how to limit the power of political authority to control and shape the population, which is always a problem when you create an authority of any kind. And the theory that Hayek offered in this work was you establish that sort of control over the state by wise institutional design, by ensuring that the state was confined to certain responsibilities. It was confined to certain duties of maintaining the legal system. It was charged with certain duties to protect individual welfare. It was charged with the duty of maintaining a system of law. But what I think Hayek came to see was that the problem with this conception of the state was that it's simply not possible to conceive of and implement the idea of a state that's going to be self-limiting. The state cannot limit itself, because once you create authority with certain sorts of powers, there are various imperatives within that structure itself that lead to a greater and greater concentration of power, and that lead to greater and greater tendencies to limit or interfere with individual liberty, ultimately in ways that are concerning for the rule of law and the operation of the law more generally. And in the 1970s, I think Hayek became more and more convinced of this. Historically, in fact, especially as a result of reading the work of the Italian jurist Bruno Leoni, who convinced him that there was a problem with the administrative state which could not be solved simply by creating more rules to limit the state. And I think this led Hayek to a change of thinking, which has been, for me, very illuminating. He then produced, in the 1970s, a work called Law, Legislation and Liberty. It was a restatement of the liberal position, but I think it changes quite dramatically from the thinking in the Constitution of Liberty, even though one can see certain continuities. And here what he started to emphasize was that we need to understand society in a different way than he had been in the Constitution of Liberty. Rather than think about a society as something that is the creature of or subsumed by the state, a society is really something which exists because human beings interact and cooperate and live side by side or interrelate even from a distance. We live in what he called an extended order of human cooperation. Human cooperation isn't shaped by or limited within a state. human cooperation exists across all boundaries. Now, if you think about human society in this way, how then should we think about states and about political authority? Hayek didn't think that we should now abandon the idea of having states or governments or political authorities. They were still necessary to perform all kinds of important functions. But we should not see them as what gives shape and meaning to our lives, nor should we see them as the crucial determinants of the way in which we cooperate. These structures exist to address certain problems and concern, but they exist within a structure within which people cooperate. In fact, even to say within a structure is misleading. They exist in a world in which people interact and cooperate. Okay? We do need to attend to these institutions because they have functions to perform, but they also pose dangers to us. But we shouldn't think of them as the units within which we think about the nature of governance or the nature of economic cooperation. In this sense, I think what Hayek was talking about was a conception of societies as existing in a kind of sea of interaction, if you like little archipelago, like an archipelago of islands, all of which have, different systems and norms and cultures and traditions, but nonetheless which also overlap and interact and see movement between people. Some of them come, some of them go, some of them, become more joined up, and some of them separate. None of this ultimately matters, because what really matters is the existence and the cooperation and flourishing of the people across this entire universe. Now, as I said before, this is not, I think, the usual way of thinking about liberalism, or for that matter, of thinking about freedom. You might think about this, for example, by contrast with another great 20th century liberal thinker, John Rawls. Now, Rawls himself was also, I think, a great defender of the liberal ideal and of the ideals of freedom and equality, which he put front and center of his thinking. But what he argued is that in order to understand what a liberal society is, we've got to imagine how people with different views and traditions and convictions, how they might associate in a way that's consistent with the liberal ideals of freedom and equality. And what Rawls suggested was we should think about societies as essentially closed systems. The society that was the unit of cooperation was the society that was given by the political state. So the question is, what are the norms and rules and laws that states should operate according to within themselves? Because these are the forms within which social cooperation takes place. These states have to decide how to distribute the fruits of cooperation, and they should figure out what are the appropriate rules of cooperation. And he suggested that within these structures, these states should adopt principles that ultimately recognized the differences among people, but at the same time also tried to socialize them so that they could all ultimately accept certain fundamental liberal norms, including norms that required the education of everybody into certain minimal liberal commitments. I think it was a conception of a just society as a liberal society that was also committed to making everybody a liberal in some minimal sense, whether they liked it or not. And he was quite candid about this. He says, sometimes we may need to exercise this coercion for the sake of making sure everybody understands the minimal constitutional essentials. And we may need to do this with regret, but we must do this. So education for liberals of this kind, I think, is fundamentally important. I think for Hayek, especially in his later work, this became much less important. I think what became much more important was recognizing that society is not something that exists as a series or a collection of separate closed systems, but rather society is continuous, in which case the interaction among people is not interaction among people as members of states or communities of particular kinds, even though people will have attachments to different groups and different families, which is not to be disparaged or despised, but nonetheless, what should be recognized fundamentally is that this cooperation and interaction can take place across a wide range of territory and can take place in different ways conceptually. The order that arises out of this is not a construction of any state or of any authority. It's an order that appears spontaneously and will ultimately disappear just as spontaneously. This is a kind of understanding of the liberal ideal, which is much less concerned with the question of how one perpetuates and preserves this than it is about trying to understand how we can honor and recognize what it is to be a liberal in this sense. Now, I don't want to exaggerate this because, of course, one of the reasons why Hayek said any of this and wrote all of this was that he was worried about what he saw as the great danger to liberalism that was the history of the 20th century. The onslaught from Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, he thought, was ultimately something that threatened to undermine and destroy civilization. So Hayek's attitude was not one of, well, you know, what happens, happens. He was not someone who thought that nothing should be done about this. But I think this is where the underlying liberal conviction, I think, becomes very, very clear. His view about how one addressed this problem was through engagement, through dialogue, through argument, through philosophy. The great task he felt that faced liberals was not that of constitutional design, it was not that of somehow the enforcement of particular rules. It was by the act of persuasion, by liberals doing, in a sense, exactly what the Institute here is doing, which is to try to get ideas and arguments onto the agenda, to try to persuade people of particular fundamental truths. Now, I think his view was not one that he held simply because he was a naive romantic about these ideals. He was someone who fought in the First World War, who was extremely troubled and disturbed by the events he saw in his native Austria and in Germany. So he was fully aware of all of the horrors of the 20th century. It was not a naive view. But on the other hand, he was equally convinced that the alternative that people had in mind to this liberal strategy, one of using coercion or force in some way to promote and entrench liberal ideas, was even worse an idea. Simply because ultimately, if people were to embrace these convictions that made liberalism possible, they would have to come to these ideas as a result of disengagement, not through coercion, not through indoctrination, not through any of the other mechanisms of state coercion that was troubling him. In a sense, what he felt was that going against the ideals of liberalism in order to preserve it was precisely the wrong way to go about it, not for romantic reasons, but for entirely practical reasons. And I think this is the thing that's most shaped my own thinking about how one conceives of a liberal society. I think it's important to think of it not as a society in the narrow sense, as a group of people related by a common nationality, living under a common political authority. That is not what a liberal society is. A liberal society is one that exists, that transcends national, political, and all kinds of other boundaries. But what about then the idea that the political reality we encounter today is one in which, of course, states do exist. There are nations, there are sub-nations, there are people who identify with one country or another. And to this, I think the main thing I want to say is that one should be mindful of how varying, how transient, and how controversial all of this is. Of course, it's true that nations exist. It's also true that many, if not all of these nations haven't existed at some time in the past, and they will all cease to exist in some time in the future. I'm not sure when, but I know that nothing lasts forever. So the idea of making one's commitment to some particular abstraction is just this. It is an abstraction, which is not to say that they're completely unimportant, but the question is, how important are they? What do you mean when you say you have your commitment to this particular abstraction? Historically, our commitments to many of these things are not there because there is some natural connection with the soil, or some natural connection with a history, which is mostly contestable and invented. It's because we have been somehow socialized into this. Now, I don't want to say that because of this, we should simply abandon all of our convictions and commitments and attachments. After all, everything is socialized. Even this talk is somehow the result of the way in which I've been brought up. And that doesn't undermine anything, but I think it also should give us some pause about how we think about these abstractions. To what extent are we willing to go in order to reify them, or to restate in more powerful terms their significance? And I think one thing that might give us a sense of this is, since we're here in Spain and we're thinking about these questions in the context of a debate about nationality, there is an important question to us: what exactly is a nationality? I've been looking into this question very closely recently because I'm writing a book on immigration. And one of the big issues in the whole debate about immigration is to what extent should we try to control immigration in order to protect the interests of nationals? But what is a national? What is someone who is a native of a country? I took a look at the law on British nationality. There is a major work on this. It's about that thick, and it covers English nationality law from about 1900 to the present. It tracks all the different changes. Okay? There are many, many different definitions of nationality. One interesting thing about it, incidentally, is that it doesn't mention the Irish at all. Because if you mention the Irish, this gets too complicated and everybody gets a bit scared. So, they've talked about everybody, the Ghanaians, the Nigerians, the Malaysians, but not the Irish. The Irish have a status, but it's entirely unstated. But the interesting thing about this account of nationality is that it has varied because the subject of nationality, or the context of nationality, is also varied, because the question of nationality can't be settled without asking, well, what is Britain or the United Kingdom? And that has changed over the years, not only because in 1922 Northern Ireland remained a part of Britain as a collection of provinces, whereas the Republic of Ireland became separate, but it's also true because Britain was an empire, as was, of course, Spain. When the British Empire started to disintegrate after the Second World War, what happened to all these people who were members of the British Empire before? They had no citizenship. they were all classified as British subjects. How many of you here, I'm not sure how well is known, know the band Queen, and Freddie Mercury? Well, Freddie Mercury was born in Zanzibar. It doesn't exist anymore as a name or a place, except as a geographical location. He moved to Britain with his mother because they weren't citizens of Britain, but they were British subjects, so they had the right to move. In one sense, that's all there was. There was no Citizenship Act in those days, so there were no British citizens, but there were British subjects everywhere. Were they nationals? Well, on one reading, they were. You could say, how many Britons were there in the world? Well, there were millions, including my ancestors in Malaysia, because my parents were born in Malaya when there was no Malayan state, but they were British subjects. My grandfather had a picture of George V on his living room wall. Okay? Were they Britons? For a while, they were, at least to the extent that they had the right to move to Britain if they wanted to. But all of these rights were gradually removed as Britain decided it didn't want members of the colonies returning to Britain. France has had the same problem. So at one point you had a conception of a national which covered, a quarter of the world. And then you had a conception of the national that was much, much more limited. What is a national? Well, my point here is that this is something that's not natural. It is something constructed and it's invented, and it's constructed and invented according to political circumstances, as a result of the outcomes of political conflicts. But there's nothing fixed or stable about it. You can reimagine things in any way. And we have, in the history of the world, imagined ourselves as communities and collectivities in so many different ways. If you simply took Europe, imagine Europe in the Middle Ages with practically thousands of different political entities. Even in 1500, there were probably 700 different European states. They were consolidated. Some of them then operated within the Holy Roman Empire, which is mostly now modern Germany. But if you look at the history of Europe, there have been so many different formations. Who now remembers the Kingdom of Lithuania, which is one of the largest political entities even in the 17th and 18th centuries? Now Lithuania is just a tiny little Baltic state. It was once the seat of a great and powerful empire. The same is true of different parts of Europe. At the start of the 20th century, Europe had shrunk to exist in only 20 states. Now we're back up to, close to 60. Who knows what it will be in the future? Again, this is not to suggest that we should therefore take this as carte blanche to simply trash any state and say we'll do whatever we like, because who cares, The universe is expanding, we'll all be destroyed eventually, nothing matters. No, that's not the point. But the point is simply to say, not to get too attached to this. Of course, there are important things to be gained by having a measure of political stability, by having a measure of social stability. People do have attachments and interests and, even loves, which are important to consider. But the point is also not to overstate this. So I think all of this really, to my mind, is a part of liberal thinking. It's a part of thinking which ultimately puts front and center a certain kind of ideal of freedom. So I started this talk by talking about the idea of freedom and saying there are many different definitions, and the problem of definition is really a kind of tricky one. Not easily solved in theoretical terms, and if you solve it in theoretical terms, it may not turn out to be that useful. But let me finish at least by saying something about how I'd like to think about freedom, which is in a certain sense a more aesthetic ideal than a hard political ideal. Here I think I take a leaf out of St. Augustine's book, city of God. When he tried to defend Christianity, in the end he didn't think he was going to do this purely by rational argument. What he had to present was a certain kind of vision or ideal that would appeal to people as something that was, in a sense, a kind of aesthetic vision, or if you like, a poetic vision. Well, for my inspiration, let me take you back to the famous speech given by Pericles in his famous funeral oration rendered by Thucydides in the history of the Peloponnesian War at the end of the first battle at which the Athenian soldiers fell. And in this oration, Pericles describes Athens. It's a somewhat idealized view of Athens. It doesn't mention slavery. It doesn't obviously mention, because why would he even think to, the different status of women. And he doesn't mention the fact that foreigners had limited rights within Athens. But he said, Athens is a city that's open to the world. And this is one of the attractive things about it. But the part of the speech that I've found especially attractive is the idea that this was a city in which people, on the one hand, were public-spirited, civic-minded. They took interest in the affairs of the city. But at the same time, they also let their neighbors go about their own business and weren't looking over their shoulders, always worried that their neighbors were intruding into their own affairs. It was a certain understanding of freedom as a kind of ease, a world in which you weren't anxious about your freedom because you were confident the fact that your freedom was something that was respected. I think this is the kind of ideal that for me lies behind the liberal outlook. Now, I can't offer you a more analytical examination of this ideal. I think to do that would probably undermine its attractiveness rather than add to it. But I think maybe it gives you a kind of sense of what it is that I'm trying to describe. Okay? This, I think, to me, ultimately, is what liberalism means. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk, and now let's start with the questions and the debate from the public.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. My question is about the Popper paradox of tolerance, that we cannot tolerate intolerance. So maybe you have found some collisions or not with your way of thinking. You can explain us. Thank you.
Yes, so in the open society, Popper expresses the view that if we are too tolerant and if we tolerate those who are intolerant, then this will simply undermine the open society. And I just think he's wrong about this, at least to the extent that his analysis is incomplete. Okay? Because what he doesn't say is how quickly tolerating intolerance will lead to this outcome. He doesn't say anything about what kind of intolerance we're looking at. He doesn't say anything about how this intolerance might be manifested. For example, does it mean that if we're going to refuse to tolerate intolerance, the moment we say we find someone expressing an intolerant view, we lock them up? Okay? The moment someone offers a view that is critical of Islam or critical of Christianity, we lock them up. Well, of course not. Okay? We have to take some kind of more measured consideration of this question. There may be circumstances in which intolerant activity needs to be checked, but maybe it's only something that needs to be checked when the intolerance is manifested in actions that are themselves dangerous, harmful, threatening. So in that sense, my own view is that if Popper means by this, well, we shouldn't tolerate freedom of speech, because if that speech is itself intolerant, then it's a danger. my attitude is, maybe it is, but let's take the risk. It means living dangerously. So I think in the end, Popper's examination is too quick, and it doesn't really get to the heart of the question.
More questions?
Thank you for your talk. In your view of the modern politics around the world, what is your sense? Are we going towards something that could be similar to the liberal archipelago, or are we going the other way around? And what do you think are the greatest dangers for a liberal society in the world?
Okay. Well, I know we've taken a very positive step in the direction of the liberal archipelago because you're translating my book, so more people will read it, and hopefully, more people will believe it, and there will be a little success. But beyond that, I really think it's just very difficult to say because, when you're living in, any of the circumstances that you're in, you don't know what are the great, forces that are moving. You only see the immediate outcomes, and so, we tend to draw trend lines based on, very, very limited amounts of evidence. So if the line is going up in this direction, we see it going this way into the future, and if it's going this direction, we see it going that way into the future. But we don't know. We don't know whether it's about to turn up or whether it's about to turn down. So I think it's very, very difficult to say. There are lots of things to be worried about, but then there are also positive developments. For most of the 20th century, a large part of the world was convinced by communism, or at least by, was under the rule of communist ideologies. There has been, I think, an enormous liberation, not just political, but also economic. But that's also had other consequences, and we don't know what these will be. So, if you look at the trend line over the last 100 years, I think it looks pretty good. If you look at the trend lines over the last 15, there are a lot of things to be worried about. Islamic terrorism as a result of affairs of the Middle East. There are reactions against the onset of capitalism in Eastern Europe. Who knows where they'll go in the short term? But okay, so your other question was, well, what are the prospects for the future in all this, and what might be done about this? Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think once again, from a liberal point of view, I think there's relatively little that one can do in terms of institutional solutions. Relatively little one can do in terms of the exercise of force to make people think or act in certain ways. I think from the liberal point of view, the most you can do is really continue to engage in this debate, to try to persuade people to pursue more peaceful means of cooperation and coexistence, which isn't to say that there may not be circumstances in which you may need to take tougher sorts of actions. If your country is attacked, that's a different circumstance, and so on. But I don't think that I see a general prescription that I can offer. So maybe if we're having a glass of wine in the pub, I'll say something different. But as a scholar, I don't think so.
Okay, more questions?
Good afternoon, sir. What would you say is stopping liberalism to take over the people's mindset right now? Because what I see, people all around the world claim for more and more social freedom, more tolerance, more respect, more independence. But in terms of economics, it seems to me it's just the opposite way around. Is it just a historical issue, or what is it? Thanks.
I think the reason it's not happening and may never happen is that I think in the end the number of people who really are whose lives are significantly shaped by thinking about politics and political principles and political ideas is very, very small. Most people are living their lives with other things guiding them. Their works, their families, their careers, their professions, their personal goals. These things are much more important, and they don't require you to acquire political commitments. They certainly don't require you to go and read my book. Okay, so this is not going to be, a major part of most people's lives. So I think, to the extent that we're concerned about what kinds of ideas people have, we're talking about a relatively small part of the community, of the society, who are engaged in politics, who are interested, and who are the ones who mobilize other people. But the other thing to bear in mind is that I think not only do most people not understand political principles and ideas and are not particularly concerned about it, most people also aren't really aware of the social processes that produce the goods that they enjoy or that they want. So what they will react to is the loss of those goods, the loss of those facilities, the changes in their circumstance. And when that happens, those who are in political authority who fail to deliver this will be criticized, they will be thrown out of office, they may even be attacked in other ways, because people are not going to stop and ask, well, what is it about the nature of the world that's leading to this? A good example of this is simply the phenomenon of globalization, which I think has produced enormous benefits, but has also had for some people great costs. The system delivers benefits of all kinds in the form of higher standards of living, but it also has destructive effects on particular communities. It's hard to have one without the other, to have the benefits without the destruction. It may lead to people saying, well, we want an end to globalization. Of course, it's not as if we have the capacity to just do this, but that will be and has been a common reaction. People want the benefits, but don't necessarily want the means, which has other effects. I don't think there's a lot you can do about this. I mean, I think you can continue to put forward the arguments, put forward the ideas, fight out the intellectual and political battles among those who are interested. But to some extent, I think you have to accept that much of the population is not going to be convinced. They're not going to be interested enough to take the trouble to find out what the reasons are. And this is going to be a permanent, problem. The only way this will be diminished is if times improve, conditions get better for certain people, and their concerns are addressed. But this is never going to be the case perfectly from what we know of human history. So that's the limit to what I think we can achieve.
What do you think of the non-aggression principle as the most well-known way to solve all the problems that are generated because of the coexistence of the different individuals and communities? Do you think it's enough, or it has to be completed with other ideas? Thank you.
So this is a question about the non-aggression principle, which is a principle that a lot of libertarians want to take as the fundamental commitment of any ethical and political regime. In one sense, of course, I like this principle because it's essentially one that says we shouldn't exercise, violence in any way to aggress against other people. But there is a theoretical difficulty with this, I think, that needs to be considered, and that is that if you accept the non-aggression principle, what is your attitude then to those who commit acts of aggression against other people? Do you commit acts of aggression against others who commit acts of aggression? Okay. Now, if you take a strict reading of the non-aggression principle, you can say no, because you should never commit acts of aggression, in which case those who are subject to aggression by others and are weaker are going to suffer. But if you say no, we're only going to use aggression to combat aggression, now you're in a very tricky position, because you'll have to establish whether or not you can aggress against someone who's committed aggression by asking whether that person who's committed aggression is justified in committing that aggression. Now, the non-aggression principle is not the fundamental principle. The more fundamental principle becomes what is the basis for deciding what is legitimate and non-legitimate aggression. So that really means the non-aggression principle can't be a sufficient starting point. Okay, it can only be a certain point in the discussion, but it can't really be fundamental. Which isn't to say that it's unimportant. It can still be a very important consideration, but in the end, you've got to weigh it up against a whole host of other ethical values with which it competes. And I think that's where the debate, has to be. It can't be just, the derivation of everything from this starting axiom.
Okay, a question about migration.
Mm-hmm.
This is not a speech, but you talk about this. We agree, as liberals, that migration is good for society, in the economy, and also in the long term, maybe on the medium. But especially these years, we have seen as maybe in some countries, the people who is receiving these migrants do not set them that easy, especially when they are coming a lot of people at the same time. And not only in Europe, for example, now in Latin America, there is a big issue with people from Venezuela is moving to the other countries. They are similar, they have the same culture, but the people in the frontiers are having some issues with Venezuelan people who is going to their countries. So when there is mass immigration and the people is really close, really similar, but there's still some problems to accept them. And this plus maybe in Europe when their problem is bigger because the people from Europe see the other people who is coming from the Middle East is more different about culture, about some private issues. So where is the is there a limit? Maybe it's good few people coming because they have some things that we can take from them and we can teach them and they can teach us. But if there is a big amount of people coming to our country, it is good, still being good or not?
Okay. So the comparison between the case of Venezuela and the neighboring countries like Colombia, where many Venezuelans are fleeing, and the case of, say, Europe and the refugee crisis, I think they're quite different. And so let me say something about each of them. In the case of Europe, in a way, the numbers are not as problematic for a couple of reasons. One is that in the context of the size of Europe, which is about 500 million people, the number of refugees is not even 1% of the total population. And in terms of the wealth of Europe, Europe is one of the richest, if not the richest, region in the world. So it's not a challenge to European resources. The problem is that the concentration of refugees in particular parts of the world where they're going, because that's where they know they might get assistance. This is what's causing the problem in these regions. And the problem is exacerbated by the inability of Europeans to come to a common agreement to settle the issue. The other side of this is that many of the countries, though not all of the countries in Europe, arguably bear some responsibility for the refugee crisis, to the extent that they have also engaged militarily in other ways in the countries that are generating the refugee flow. Whether you think about the original American invasion of Iraq, which destabilized that area, or the invasion of Afghanistan, or the bombing of Libya, all of this has generated, refugee flows. So one might argue that if you have taken that responsibility in the first place to destabilize regimes for your own particular ends, and then you're faced with the crisis, you may have some responsibility to address it in some way, because you're not the sole cause, but you're certainly a part of the cause. So I think there is some responsibility there on the part of European nations to address this, and there are lots of different ways it might be addressed. But so far, I think the Europeans have not been able to come to any answer on this. But in the case of Venezuela, I think it's more difficult, because although Colombia is doing quite well now, it's still not a rich country, and the problems in Venezuela are the result of a very, very crazy version of socialism, even by socialism's strange standards. That you don't see a country collapse this rapidly, just in less than a decade, unless you've got some really bad policies going on. And in this particular case, I do feel for the people in Colombia who have to cope with this. I don't think I'd want to say, well, you have an obligation to help people. But there is also, if you like, a kind of norm of good Samaritanism. If someone turns up in distress, if you can afford to, you have to help. If you can't, well, you may not be able to help, but at least you should be willing to let those who do want to help have that, freedom to engage, their own resources and so on. But this is a very difficult problem. I don't think I've got an easy answer to this, because I don't think I can go to the Colombians and say, look, you have to do this. It's not your responsibility. But I do think these two different cases are quite different.
Good afternoon. Your honest opinion, this may sound a bit open question and too personal, but do you think that freedom can be taught, or is something that lies within some certain humans and it kind of blooms when you reach a certain point in time and they gather together and they create this kind of freedom in society you were talking?
Mm-hmm. Actually, it's a very good question, because in a way it's quite an old philosophical question, certainly in the European tradition, whether human beings are naturally free and naturally inclined to freedom. My own view is that it is in the end something that's taught, really, or at least learned, because it's fairly clear to me that there are lots of societies where this is not something that is especially valued, even though I think in a certain way, of course, nobody in any society likes to be prevented from doing whatever it is that they want to do, whether they want to do it because it fills their desires or because they do it because they've been taught that it's their duty. Once you've got this impulse to do something, to be prevented is always something that you are naturally inclined to resist. But of course, what you may want to do is you may want to fast and deprive yourself. You may want to go into a monastery. You may want to take a vow of silence. They're all things that, of course, mean restricting your own freedom. So to be a person who values freedom, I think, is to be someone who has been in some way taught or socialized into this to at least some degree. I think this is a value that is the product of the development of a certain kind of civilization. So yeah, to that extent, I think it's something that has to be cultivated.
Thank you very much for your talk. I think that today individual freedom is quite counterintuitive because as the pace of changes due to technological innovations, etc., we are living in a world in which our jobs are threatened by robotization, and globalization is also a threat because migrants are coming to rob our jobs, etc. Well, or at least this is what most of people in our society tends to think. I think that maybe the defense of individual freedom and responsibility today is counterintuitive because nationalism is viewed as a way to protect to ourselves, and that's why most people prefer state control or governmental control instead of individual freedom. What do you think about this view of our society?
I think that's right, because it has at least a part of the truth. But I think there's also something else, and that is that when you grow up in a state, you grow up in a kind of social order in which the importance of the state is always reinforced, because you're told from the very beginning that there is a flag, there is an anthem, there is a football team, there are the Olympics, there are all these things that attach you to this entity and make the meaning of your life in some part contingent upon this. And more broadly, there is a narrative that many states, but not all states, like to promote, which is a narrative of the greatness of the state being something in which you can share. Okay? So it appeals, in a sense, to something that is, I think, in our nature. Certainly, this is the way that a philosopher like Thomas Hobbes describes it. There's something in our nature that longs for glory. But we not only enjoy having personal glory, but we enjoy the glory that comes with being associated with something that is itself somehow great. By many accounts, for Russians, after the collapse of communism and the decline of the Soviet Union and its return as Russia, for many people that was a loss, because their status as Russians was diminished. Now, if you're someone who doesn't care about status, who doesn't care about glory, it will be of no great significance. But I think the fact is that for many people this is important. And I think one of the reasons it's important is that states have an interest in promoting this narrative, okay? Because the most important thing a state has to do in order to survive, or any regime has to do, is to ensure that the population accept its legitimacy. Okay? And how do you do it? You do it by supplying their physical needs, but you also have to supply their emotional needs. And one way to do this is to say, you are French, or you are Malaysian, or you are Australian, and this is what it means to be Australian, and this is why it's great. Okay? And it's hard to imagine people growing up in such an environment and not buying into this. I mean, even to this day, if Australia's cricket team loses, I feel bad. Okay, I can't help it. It's just, I will forever support Australia in the cricket. But there's a certain part of me that also knows that this is not because Australia is, the greatest cricket team. It is, but that's not the reason. Okay? It's because this is the way I've been brought up to think. Okay? I think this is something that's just inevitable And that's why I think this is the other side of the equation in the question you raised.
Thank you for the talk. And I wanted to ask about immigration again, and that in Europe, if we open the borders to the refugees, maybe we don't consider the negative effects of this immigration. For example, the integration of the culture, and maybe the other effects of Islamic fundamentalism that is really strong in Muslim societies right now. So, what do you think about this?
I think you're right to think that taking in refugees does pose a lot of challenges, including the ones that you've mentioned, the challenges of integration, for example. So I don't think it would be possible to have a refugee policy that admits people that doesn't take these things into account. You have to think about, if you've got people moving in, not just refugees, but people moving in from anywhere, which is continuing to happen for reasons of employment, of resource scarcities, the demands of European business for labor and so on. All of these things, I think, are things we have to think about, because the integration of people in a society, in a mobile world, is a challenge. So the refugee case, I think, is just another instance of this. Okay? But you mentioned one very specific concern, which is the possibility of admitting those who are Islamic fundamentalists, who might be somehow destabilizing. And I think that actually is, to my mind, less of a worry, because the influx of Muslims, in a way, has two kinds of effects. On the one hand, it may mean that there are some people who come in with anti-Western ideas and are going to form communities which are hostile. On the other hand, you could also see it as a safety valve. Okay? There are clearly, for all kinds of important historical reasons, mostly reasons of recent history, there are people in the Muslim world who are anti-Western, who are angry, who are, unhappy about their condition. And because of the state of the Muslim world in very many parts of the world, because of the history of warfare, which is turning them into refugees, the opportunities are not there for them. So having them given an opportunity to go somewhere where they could make a life actually may make them less vulnerable to radicalization, less likely to turn to this other path. Because what a lot of the literature shows us, not just about Muslims, but even about, say, white working class minorities who are disaffected, what's making them less likely to be radicalized is the fact that they've got opportunities. They've got the possibility of a career, of making a life. So the more people who are given that opportunity, there's also less likelihood that they will turn to other means to express themselves and to find solutions. So I think you're right about the danger, but there's also the aspect of it, which is that this may be a safety valve. Now, what is the balance? I think that's much more difficult to say, and I'm not going to try to give you an answer to this, but I think we need to look at both sides of this question.
Let me introduce a little bit about on the Catalonia issue. You advocate for personal secession as the last expression of liberalism, and some people tend to agree with this, but they counterclaim that one thing is personal secession, another thing is territorial secession. This is, of course, you are free to leave any country, but you are not free to take the territory of that country. So Catalonian people can live the political authority of Spain just by leaving Spain. And Spanish government respects that freedom because he has not built a barrier that blocks the freedom to exit. What kind of differences would you would you express between secession as a jurisdictional thing, including the territory, and freedom to exit and to separate from the territory where some government exerts political authority?
Well, I think you're quite right about the way you characterize the difference between these two forms of secession. You know, exiting in person is one thing, trying to take away the territory is another. Though, of course, in one way it's slightly misleading to use that terminology because no one is going to take any territory away. The territory is going to stay exactly where it is. No one is going to cut off a part of Spain and take it to Australia. It's still going to be there. So the question is really not so much a question of taking away territory as reconfiguring the nature of the authority. Now, there are a lot of different ways, of course, of doing it. One way would simply be by the devolution of responsibilities for various sorts of things. And that already exists. Clearly, the different provinces of Spain have some things that are subject to control by the national government, some things that are their responsibility supplied by resources from the national government, and there are other things that they may be completely responsible for. I believe in Catalonia, for example, the language is something that is the local language rather than something that's shaped by Spanish requirements. So the question is, how much devolution can you and should you have? Of course, the ultimate form of devolution is independence. Okay? Now, here it seems to me that it's not that it's sufficient just because 51% of a population wants to leave, that this would be a reason why there should be devolution to the extent of the severing of all political ties with the larger society. But it's not insignificant either. And I think the more significant is the size of the population that wants to separate. Then the question becomes, what is the justification for keeping that connection? I mean, this is a justification that not only the state has to offer, but I think it's a justification that the minority have to offer as to, you know, why their fellow Catalonians shouldn't be ruling themselves rather than being ruled by someone else. So what kind of a justification could, in the case of Catalonia, the Spanish government give or the Catalonian minority give to the majority of Catalonians as to why they should be a part of Spain? It seems to me that a very big reason why the right to secede should be a very powerful consideration is that if you think about a political society as an association of people who want to be governed together, then if they don't wish to be, then one very important principle of modern democratic states is that everybody accepts the legitimacy of the government. It's not like a monarchy where this is all decided by some external authority who's not legitimated. This is a matter of what the people are willing to acquiesce in. And it's not just that it's a matter of consent, because no one has consented, but if they aren't willing to agree to associate, what reason can you give? Now, if the reason you give is that this is better for us, it's hard to see why they should be convinced by this. If the answer is, well, we own this territory, I don't think that is convincing either, because who is it who owns it? I mean, the state is just an abstraction. It may own certain public lands, but private lands it doesn't own. The public lands it only owns in trust. It could be under the control of different authorities if that responsibility was devolved. So I think what has to be given is some very strong reason why that devolution to that degree shouldn't take place. Now, it may be, for example, a good reason would be, look, this would endanger the rest of the society if there was, let's say, a military threat. If let's say, the western or the eastern part of Israel decided that it wanted to secede, I think the rest of the Israelis might say, well, no, we're living in a dangerous world, and this is important for our security. We won't let you secede. That would be understandable. If you want us to secede and your part of the country is the coast, and now the rest of the country would be landlocked, you can see why people would have a reason to say, no, I don't think you should secede. What reason can the Spanish give to the Catalonians? I think that is the critical question. And if they can't give an answer that the Catalonians will buy, and they can't give an answer that the rest of the world can see, okay, that's reasonable because your interests are badly affected, then I think they've got a difficulty. But if they can come up with some reason that says, look, this will really harm the rest of the population, then I think they've got a case. The thing is that if the reason is, if we allow the secession, this will diminish this particular ideal, then I think it's a very tricky case, because what about the people who don't buy into the ideal? Then you're saying to them, you must buy into this ideal. And I think they have a legitimate question, which is, why must we?
Any other question?
Another problem with Catalonia is that many people say that if we give independence to Catalonia, then we will have the Basque Country, Valencia, Galicia, etc. And then what about Spain? What do you think? Do you think that there should be some requirements in order to give independence to one region, or once we give independence to one region, many others could be also independent or not?
So I think that could be a problem. But once again, I think I would want to ask, okay, and what is the impact of this going to be on the well-being of people in Spain? Okay, and I also want to ask now, how likely is this to happen? I think it is a legitimate consideration. I mean, if for example, suddenly this is going to promote the breakup of Spain and all the complexity that this involves, you might say, okay, this is a reasonable worry, and that those who want to secede have got to give some explanation about why nonetheless they've got a case. But I think you also have to ask, okay, how likely is this to happen? Is it really the case that everybody wants to secede? And also, I think if everybody does want to secede, why is it that you're keeping them together? If they really are that desperate to go, okay. But you can't have it both ways. If you want to say, look, this is Spain and everybody wants to be in Spain, but then you also say, well, the trouble is if you do this, everybody will leave Spain. Both things can't be true.
When you say impact, do you mean economic impact? When you say well-being on the rest
so I think the economic impact would be a very important part of it. I mean, if it has the consequence of, for example, creating a world in which there are many more barriers to trade and interaction and movement within Spain, which has, anticipated consequences for employment, for business, for trade, and also for just the communication and interaction of people personally, because there are now barriers. I think this is an important consideration. Someone may well say, look, if you do this, given elements of history, it may have all of these unfortunate consequences. We have created this society which has solved all these other problems. Do we want to go back to all conflicts? That may be a legitimate consideration. I think, I don't think you can just say, well, no, the right to secede trumps no matter what the consequences. But I think you also have to put a pretty good case to say these will be negative consequences.
Okay, thank you very much. It's been tenemos que terminar ya. It's been a great honor you to be here, and thank you very much for this wonderful conference and this wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.